Our gospel lesson this morning is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. You find this to be a very familiar story. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the borderland between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourself to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then Jesus said to the man, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Yesterday, the Minnesota Gophers played the Iowa Hawkeyes in football. The wrong team won. As a prelude to the game on television, the producers interviewed fans as they were going into the stadium. The question was, can you say anything good about the other team? Fans supporting both schools were invited to share a kind word. Needless to say, there were very few. Iowa and Minnesota are a bit like Kentucky and Indiana in basketball. There's not much love there. The best answer to the question, in fact, the only one that was at all positive, was delivered by a Minnesota fan who said, "At least they're not Wisconsin." When we think of boundaries, most of us jump straight to the idea of state or national boundaries, the artificial lines drawn between people. Luke follows the same route. He makes a point of telling us that Jesus is in the borderland between Samaria and Israel, between the Samaritans and the Jews. There was long-standing hostility between the two peoples. It all began back in the 10th century before Christ, when the nation Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. You may remember that Israel and Judah were one country under King David and then King Solomon. But when Solomon died, the land was divided into two countries, and it was ruled by 2 of Solomon's sons. So not only did there develop this bitter rivalry between the sons, but the two nations, the two Jewish countries, became rivals as well. This rivalry became more and more developed after Assyria conquered them. Now, when Babylon conquered Judah, the southern tribe, they hauled the leaders off to Babylon. Part of the story that Janet read for us this morning was the prophet Jeremiah telling them, "We know that you're in exile, we know that you're in Babylon, but build your home there. Have families. Work for the peace of the city, because your welfare depends upon that peace." Now, why did they hate each other so much? Well, when Assyria conquered Israel in the north, they didn't haul anybody off. They destroyed everything and drove all the people out of Israel, making the first diaspora. There were no more Jews in Israel. They were spread all over. And many of them settled in the land of Samaria. And in that land of Samaria, they intermarried. And they took on the practices of the Samaritans, who were also partly Jewish. Now, the biggest difference religion-wise was that the Jews in Judah went to Jerusalem to sacrifice. But the Jews in the diaspora went to the high places, those places that the priests had tried to destroy and knock down, those places like Bethel that were considered high holy places where the people went up and offered sacrifices because there was no temple in Samaria and they were not welcome in Jerusalem. Now, Jesus was in that borderland. Like so many borderlands, take the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. It was probably an unsafe place, a place of open hostility. So we should not be surprised when one of the 10 persons to be healed was a Samaritan. We ought to be surprised that it wasn't more than 1 out of 10. But this story is really not about geographical borders. Rather, it's about gratitudinal borders. It is primarily about seeing. Those who travel into enemy territory, say Nashville, for a Vanderbilt football game, try to avoid being those typical gawkers looking up at the big city and all the buildings, so that everybody knows these are obviously Kentuckians. They don't really see what they're looking at. They're just looking around. It's pretty easy to notice things without really seeing them. It would have been easy for Jesus to pass by the men with leprosy, even with their shouting. It would have been understandable if he had kept his head down and ignored them. But Luke tells us that Jesus sees them. In seeing them for who they were, he could see that there was a common need, and in seeing he chose not to act. Notice he doesn't see that one is a Samaritan. That doesn't matter. He simply sees that there are 10 in need of a healing touch. So Jesus crosses the boundary, telling them to go and show themselves to their priest because it took a priest to say they were clean. And as they respond to Jesus, as they go, they are healed. Now, I don't know if any of the other 9 had noticed that their situation had changed, that their illness had been healed or not. We're not told if they saw their skin was no longer marked by the disease, but one of them did. One of them did see. Just as Jesus saw the need, one of the 10 saw they'd been healed. And when he saw he'd been healed, he recognized that that was something that only God could do. Being healed was something that only God could do. So he showed his gratitude. And his gratitude wasn't impacted by those religious differences. He showed his gratitude by turning around and praising God. For whether they were worshiping in Bethel or in Jerusalem, they were worshiping the same God. We all have borders. We all have borderlines within which we live, and invariably there will be times when that borderland is dangerous. The borderland may be physical. We are unable to do all the things that we have done before. We're unable to eat all the wonderful foods or drink all the drinks we used to consume. It may be an emotional borderland, the loss of a lifelong love, the separation from a child headed off to school, the anger at a cultural situation that you find deeply disturbing. The borderland may be spiritual, a crisis of faith, the sadness at a broken church, the discovery of a serious illness, the unexpected death of one far too young. And when we find ourselves in the borderland, it's easy for us to lose our character, to take on a new identity. It's easy for us to become bitter or to become angry, to become depressed, to isolate ourselves. It's easy to lose sight of caring friends and family, and we may even see them as non-entities or enemies. That's exactly where the people who Jeremiah addressed were. They were in that borderland. In fact, they were well beyond the borderland, living deep inside of Babylon, having been hauled into captivity. Every day they see the enemy all around. Every day they see helplessness. Every day they see only a stark and broken future. Nowhere do they see God. The borderland where they are, one of the borders is that God can't enter that space. God is the God of Israel, not the God of Babylon. So they don't see God either. But that's not what Jeremiah sees. Jeremiah sees a land where the people can thrive. He sees a land where the people should put down roots. They should build homes. They should marry their sons and daughters. They should have families. They should seek the peace of the city where they dwell. Jeremiah doesn't see the borderland as a place filled with enemies. He sees the borderland as a place of prosperity and security. And Jeremiah sees God at work in the borderland of Babylon. I imagine that the 10 men in Luke's story had pretty much lost all faith in God. Their life was hopeless misery. There was no cure for their illness. They were isolated and weren't allowed to be part of the community. They were considered unclean, couldn't be in the town. So perhaps we shouldn't be too hard on the 9 who failed to see God's hand in their healing and turn around and give thanks. Just as we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves when we find ourselves living in our own personal borderland. But the one who recognized God's hand in their life, recognized God at work even in this hopeless situation, that one responded with gratitude. Whether we are thankful or whether we are unthankful depends not so much on what we see. It depends on who we see. We see our lives begin to make sense again. We see that medical treatment, the surgery, the chemo, the radiation, all have a positive effect. We see our one-time friends as friends once more, and we think that we've done this. We've beaten cancer. We've turned a business disaster into a huge success. and we don't see God's hand in our turnaround, so we don't turn around and give thanks. If this were a statistical story, we would say that there is a 1 in 10 chance that any of us are going to see God and give thanks. I don't like those odds. Now, I wanted to end this morning by saying something like, I don't know if it's possible for a Kentuckian to see a person on the street wearing a Duke shirt I knew we wouldn't get through this service without Nelson being engaged. Thanks for waiting till the end. I don't know if it's possible for a Kentuckian to see a person on the street wearing a Duke's shirt and not feel a tinge of hatred. Instead of seeing the person inside the shirt, all that we see is the shirt. Who knows? They may be Kentucky fans. We immediately jump to conclusions and we marginalize them. They live on the other side of our border. But if I were to end this sermon with that, I think I would trivialize the need for seeing people as who they are rather than what they are. And even more, it makes it hard to see God at work in our lives, even and especially when it seems that God is nowhere present. But Luke comes here telling us that God is here all the time, everywhere, healing our broken lives, moving us out of the borderland into places of safety and security, encouraging us to keep our eyes open to see the person rather than the thing. Because we're all God's children. And in Jesus Christ, we're all brothers and sisters, whether we're from Samaria or from Israel, whether we're for the Gophers or the Hawkeyes, whether we're for Kentucky or Duke, we're all God's children. Amen.